Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2018 Gathering of Men, hosted by the Todd Anthony Bell National Resource Center on the African American Male. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight and being a part of this special occasion. My name is Andreas Williams, and I am the program coordinator for the Bell Center. I take honor in saying that I am a product of this center, having graduated from Ohio State in May of 2017. During my time as an undergrad here, I was highly involved within all of the initiatives and the programs that the Bell Center has to offer. And I can testify to tonight being one of the most influential. Before I turn things over to Dr. Moore and our keynote speaker for tonight, allow me to acknowledge all of the entities that we have in attendance, from the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and Ohio State staff to community partners, professionals, and students. Please take a second to look around the room and appreciate all of the excellence you are surrounded by. This deserves a round of applause. As you all know, it is very rare to have so many high-achieving people of color in one space, which is why it is the Bell National Resource Center's intent in hosting, sponsoring, and gathering the Gathering of Men every year to cultivate the ultimate networking and fellowship environment, thus helping build positive community relationships, something that our keynote speaker fits this theme very perfectly, and he will hit on that later on in the program with his expertise in urban education and at-risk youth. We are very excited about tonight's program and the relationships that will be forged, as over the years, the Gathering of Men has proven to be fruitful while providing relationships for peer support and mentorship among all the attendees. BNRC students take full advantage of the networking opportunity that will take place later in the program. And if you are interested in gaining leadership development and community outreach experience, come talk to me and learn about the great up-and-coming ways to get involved through our office. That extends to every member of our team that works extremely hard to ensure that programs like tonight's take place. It wouldn't be possible without them, all of ODI, our community partners, and students. It takes all of us coming together and working hard to make sure that we have a true impact. At this time, please join me in welcoming our Executive Director and Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion, Dr. James Moore.
Good evening. Good evening. All right. On behalf of the Todd Anthony Bell National Resource Center on the African American Male and its fabulous staff, I just want to bring warm greetings and salutations. Today is a momentous occasion. It's not every day that we bring the excellence and the gathering of the minds all together in one space. This is an event that we all look forward to because it gives us an opportunity to not only showcase our young men who are on campus, but not only that, to bring someone who's eminent in their own right to interact with us. I wanted to share a little information with you about some of our successes, and I won't be long-winded about it, but one that I think is very relevant for today. At Ohio State University, I hadn't seen the new numbers, but from last year, we had approximately 1,200 African American male undergraduate students on our campus. Now, we recognize that an institution of this size, we certainly should be doing a lot better. But one of the things that I do want to share, that I argue that it's probably not a university in the whole entire country with such numbers, including Morehouse College, the only college in America that focused specifically on African American males. This year we had approximately 577 African American males on our campus with a cumulative GPA of 3.0 or better. Nearly 50% of our success is important, and so something what the guys we don't take for granted is that we don't leave anything up for chance, because we think it's we try to foster an ethos of excellence. And regardless of your zip code, regardless who your parents are or who your grandparents are, we believe that you can do exceptionally well at Ohio State University. It does not suspend the numbers, that we're not going to keep working on the numbers. That will be a vigilant pursuit like always. But one of the things that we're very unapologetic about is success. We see academic success is like your social security number. It follows you everywhere you go, and when you come 40 or 50, you still have the same GPA. And so it's very important that we recognize that. Not only that, I want to recognize that we're one of the few centers of its kind housed at a major research university in the country. We've had over 50 different universities from around the country, even University of Pennsylvania, Yale University, University of Texas, Minnesota, Clemson University, Fayetteville State, Howard University, and Morehouse College. Those are just some of the few who either have contacted us via telephone, email, or even visited us. There's something in the air, something profound and prophetic that is happening at Ohio State University. We have a rich history at this institution. We've been doing diversity and inclusion for a very long time, before it became a term or a fad in this country. We were graduated one of the first African Americans in the 1890s. So we have a rich history at this institution. But not only that, some people only think about us for our athletics, but we have a rich history around diversity and inclusion on this campus. Tonight, and at another juncture in the program, we'll certainly be recognizing our keynote speaker, Dr. Howard Stevenson. This year, he was the recipient of our nationally highly coveted award, the Mac A. Stewart Award for Service, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I would be remiss, not that it's about many of you all, how many in here know Brian Stevenson or heard that name before? So last year we had Brian Stevenson on campus. This year we got Howard Stevenson, and they're brothers. So they come from good stock, as we would say in the South, strong pedigree, but a pedigree that is steeped in service and making a difference in other people's lives. His brother is most recognized right now as creating the Memorial for Justice and Peace, AKA the Lynching Museum. And next month, we're going to be sending a group of students to Montgomery, Alabama to actually have that experience. What is driven by that is almost, I think it was inspired by some of the Holocaust museums, and what is framed within that is never again. Never again should no one have to experience that again. But it speaks to also the pain, but as we would say, the healing is in the pain. Much of the work, now enough about his brother, I want to talk about Dr. Howard Stevenson. I think the older brother, if I'm correct. And I'm the oldest in my family. I'm the older brother, and I like to think I'm the best looking one as well as the smartest one. But that's another story. Dr. Howard Stevenson is the Constance Clayton Professor of Urban Education. He's a professor of Africana Studies in the Human Development and Quantitative Methods Division of the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the executive director of the Racial Empowerment Collaborative at University of Penn, designed to promote racial literacy in education, health, community, and justice institutions. Backed by a $12 million grant from the Robert Wood Foundation. And this is a highly coveted grant that he just recently received that is focuses on improving the quality of life, educational attainment for males of color. in the program is referenced as the Forward Promise, a national philanthropic office that promotes a culture of health for boys and young men of color to help them heal from trauma of historical and present day dehumanization, discrimination, and colonialization. He's a nationally recognized clinical psychologist, researcher on negotiating racial conflict using racial literacy for independent and public K-12 schooling, community health centers, teachers, police, and parents. 2 mental health research projects funded by the National Institute of Health examine the benefits of racial literacy. His program, Preventing Long-Term Anger and Aggression in Youth project, uses basketball, and racial socialization to help youth, parents cope with stress from violence and social rejection. He has a litany of many accomplishments. If you don't mind, join me as he walked to the lectern, with greeting him with a hearty round of Buckeye applause. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Dr. Moore, for that introduction. It is an honor to be here, and it's an honor to receive this award. Your history and your accomplishments are known all over the country, and it's an honor to actually see you in person after hearing all the news and hearing about what you do on behalf of all students, but particularly for men. Given the way the world is approaching black men in this time, it's very important for us to think about the work that you all are doing. So thank you very much for this honor. And yes, I am Brian Stevenson's older brother. The challenge, though, is as we were growing up, we had very different kind of maturation. So Brian was early mature, and he could grow a beard by the age of 12. I think I just started having hair on this side and this side at the same time about 10 years ago. So when he was a teenager, he looked like a grown man. And so there would be people calling the house, and I'd answer the phone, and they were interested in him. In this case, women who were interested in him. I'd say, look, I'm the older brother, but that didn't matter in the social discourse of who looks older and who actually is older. But he's my best friend, and so I love talking about him. I love talking about the work that he does. And I'll share a little bit about our story growing up as part of the narrative. I'd like to think about this notion, and when we think about health, we think about men of color, African American men, this notion of the importance of belonging, but not fitting in. And so when we look at the research I've been doing for almost 30 years, it's called racial socialization. But in a nutshell, what it means is, does it matter when your family or your neighborhood, your community talks to you about how to navigate racial politics? And so for over those 30 years, we've been finding quite a bit that racial socialization is a protective factor for a variety of outcomes, including academics, academic achievement, academic engagement, and in my work, looking at issues of anger management and depression management. And so there is this notion that the more parents say they talk to their children about race, the more those children on other measures look very positive when it comes to negotiating schooling, neighborhood, and peer-to-peer relational politics and dynamics. Now the question is, how does that seem to be a positive thing, right? And particularly in a culture, in a country that does not like talking about race. Our work now is no longer interested in demonstrating talking about race to young people is a positive thing. We could go on forever talking about what that means. There are very differential sort of ways of looking at that research. Now we're actually trying to demonstrate, if you do it well, what does that look like? And so instead of socialization, which is what parents say to kids, what communities say to kids, what media says to young people and young men. But also, what is it that young people take in? What is it that we all take in from a world that socializes around race day in and day out, 24/7? And so literacy is a word that we're using now to identify how skillful am I to read when a racial moment shows up? And how can I navigate that moment so I walk away with my life intact, but also with my values, with my culture, with my sense of who I am also intact, right? You ever been in a racial moment where you were unprepared and you walk away feeling, I wish I could have, if I only, my goodness, if they come back one more time, I'm going to finally say what it is that I really wanted to say, right? You ever had that moment? And particularly in predominantly white spaces, there are these dynamics upon which we find ourselves having to fit in order to not stand out, because the larger narrative about us standing out is not all that positive. So we've been looking now at this notion of racial politics and socialization and literacy, not just because we want to make the world a better place, not just because we want people to be more moral when they think about it, because we're not so sure that morality and innocence and goodness are enough for people to make changes in the lives of black men and black families. Now we're interested in health, right? So instead of encouraging people to talk more about race, I say it more like this. If you knew that your son or daughter, whether they're in high school or preschool or college, could gain an hour of sleep over the next 15 years because you spoke to them about how to navigate racial politics, would you then have the conversation? Right? And if you look at some of the research that's out here, there's a lot more now that we know about the experience of being different in the world and sleep. Right? And sleep, we know, is very integral to health, whether it is focusing, whether it is listening, whether it is embracing, whether it is getting the most out of your experience, whether it's educational or personal or interpersonal. We know more now about how being stressed by being thought of as not human is detrimental to one's well-being. And sleep is a core issue. So most of our work from the next 20 years is really going to be about how do we use racially literate moments to support other health outcomes that are then related to every other outcome you want to identify, from work, from school, to health on a lot of levels. Physical and mental health, for example. So this notion of belonging versus fitting in is very important. And so there's an African proverb that we use in our work. It's called, the lion story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. Does that make sense? The lion story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. Now the way I'm framing this notion of lion story is that belonging is different from fitting in. Belonging is this sense that I accept my difference and my own competence, that I'm here for a reason, I can do what I'm here for, and I believe in the way that I go about doing it is healthy and whole, despite the narratives that people might have of me. This is my story, and if I hold on to that story, the definition of belonging is set. That is, I belong as a function of how much I accept my own narrative and my own competence to do what it is I'm supposed to be here to do. Fitting in is something different, though. Fitting in is about depending on others' narratives about me, or others' acceptance of me, my difference, and my competence. And therein lies some of the challenges around what some of the thoughts some of you may have heard my brother talking about regarding narrative change. Because if you look at the narratives in the public space, you'll find that they're not very positive. And so how do we create our own narratives? It's something you're doing here at Bell Center so powerfully. That only can young men stay here, but they belong here. They know where they belong, so they can act out their gifts in the most productive way. So belonging is a narrative, a story I create. Fitting in is a shape-shifting that I have to sort of make other people feel comfortable. And I would argue that over time, that's a health risk. And that there's a health cost to that shape-shifting. And so while belonging, I would say, is healthy, fitting in is not. So belonging is the lion story and fitting in is the hunter story. So the first thing I would say to you is tell your story, right? Don't let somebody else tell your story, but you tell your story. At the center, we call a Racial Empowerment Collaborative. We're interested in a lot of things, but the two things that matter are in the moment and face-to-face. So we're interested in race, not so much ideologically or politically. We think that's important. The systemic interventions that many people have done, including my brother at the Supreme Court, have been very powerful. But those legal remedies do not address the day-to-day traumas we know build up in a person's body, mind, and soul that need to be addressed, not now. So that the fact that I wish I coulda, I should have spoken up, for some people that'll last a day. But for some people it'll last 2 days or 7 days or 2 months. And in my work, we found folks where it lasts 50 years. That I remember moments in which I was dehumanized and I didn't speak up to that moment, and I still carry that in my heart. I still carry that in my soul. I still carry it in my conversation with my daughter or my son or my roommate. And therein lies the work that we think we have to do. So we're more interested in what happens in the moment and face-to-face encounters, because if you look at what's happening with police and youth and young men, those moments are less than 2 minutes. And I'm not so sure we have the politics or the strategies of racial engagement that teach us how to navigate 2 minutes as opposed to 2 hours. These decisions have to be made in shorter period times, and that's what we're focusing on. And so with that, I would argue that telling your story is important. And in many respects, and on some of the projects, we mentioned the basketball project we call Play. We've done this since 1999. We go to basketball courts around the country. And some of you know how basketball is. If you play basketball, if you watch it on television, there's always these moments where somebody who thinks they can play, the reality of their talent clashes with the idea of their talent, right? We got great ideas about what we can do, but the reality of what actually I can pull off in the moment is very stressful. And it's a wonderful playground for psychologists to watch what people do when that clash occurs, right? People talk trash, they blame other people, they throw the ball. We worked in discipline schools in the city of Philadelphia for 4.5 years, 4 days a week, and we watched kids before they fought, during the fight, and after the fight, because they're still children. And we got a sense of what their strengths and weaknesses are. And we know it's not just happening with boys in kindergarten or preschool or middle school or high school, but it's happening to men at the University of Pennsylvania. I got a story about that, but I'll save that for another time. So the notion of, can I bring cultural, racial socialization and literacy to a basketball court when people are at their most stressed out, so they can develop new strategies to problem solve and to see what's happening to them in that moment? That's the goal. Another project, the Barbershop Project, where we train over 700 young men in the city of Philadelphia, starting with barbers. You all know barbershops. A lot goes on in the barbershop, right? There's a way in which young men between the ages of 18 to 24, we targeted over 5 years. We were trying to get to 1,100. We only got to 700 in those 5 years. We train African-American barbers to be health educators in 2 areas, sexual risk reduction, and my area was on violence retaliation reduction. And you know the barbers are good. There are ways in which barbers can persuade us to try new hairstyles we would never try, and in many respects give us strategies on how to cope with anything from violence in relationships, gang warfare. We learned a lot about barbershops. We learned a lot about the men who go to barbershops who will share very personal information in a haircut appointment that they would not share with a partner or a religious leader that they identify with and would respect. There are ways in which, in that model, we learned a lot about how men from prison can go to barbershops and still get work in places that they cannot get work in other ways. But even in this project, we taught the same skills around literacy, around storytelling. So the notion of telling your story is important, but there's also the issue of remembering your story. Sometimes we come to these places And Penn is one of those kind of places where people put on a lot of pretending who you are, right? To be pretending is a big issue. If you don't remember your story, though, you can get lost in that craziness, right? So my brother and my sister and I'm the oldest of three. My sister Christy, brother Brian, we grew up in a community, in a multicultural household. Two parents, both African American, but they're very different from each other. They're just as different from each other as East is from West. My mother grew up in North Philadelphia. Anybody heard of North Philadelphia? And my father grew up in Southern Delaware. Anybody heard of Delaware? Anybody here from Delaware? No? Most people just drive through Delaware and keep on going to some other place. There are two Delawares. There's a lower Delaware and there's an upper Delaware. And people in upper Delaware look down on people in lower Delaware as slower, lower Delawareans. I joke about the fact that, there is a different country in southern Delaware. Once you pass Smyrna, you're going back a ways. It's like going, for some people, the image of Mississippi. And having spent some time in Mississippi with civil rights workers, it feels a lot like Mississippi. 2.5 miles from where we grew up in a place called Slaughter Neck, there was a KKK rally. We had messages around where not to go, right? But my father had us, what my father dealt with when it came to racial sort of politics, he taught us if anybody ever treated us as a function of our difference, that you were supposed to pray for them, because he had us in church what seemed like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He did not believe in physical retaliation. He believed in a spiritual retaliation. So you pray for them, knowing that God would get them back in the end. That was his approach. I grew up in a community of folks who don't understand Ivy League. They don't understand University of Pennsylvania. Some of them not educated, but they helped to grow us. The first book I wrote, I had to write a book that I could take back home that they could pick up and read. Because their fear for me was that I would go away and forget who I was. And I forget who they were. And if I forgot who they were, then I was sick. Then I was going to be sick. And so people would want to know questions about, have you forgotten us? Do you remember my name? I went back about, and there's some people even now that say to me, you've been in school a long time, man. When you getting out? You okay? You need some help, right? They don't understand Penn. They don't understand being chair of a psych department. They don't understand any of that. But they helped to raise us, Brian and Kristen. I went back about 15 years ago for my father, who passed away about 1.5 years ago, to go to the supermarket to get him some stuff. And I did it in my city-fied way. I went through, got the stuff as quick as I could, right? And the church folk that we grew up with, it just so happened on the day I went, I passed by the praying lady from our church, Ms. Warren. Now I know some of you may have been to a church, or you've seen a church on television, or a black church. We know everybody prays. But there's some people who really, really know how to pray. Isn't that right? And Mrs. Warrington was that person from our church. She's about this tall. In public, you could miss her. That's why I was rushing, I missed her. Walked right by her. But when she kneeled down in church, she rocked the house. She brought thunder and lightning. These people, God comes for them quicker, right? There's a way in which she had that kind of power, but I missed her. On my way home, she called my father up. She said, Hobby, which was his nickname, there's something wrong with your boy. I said, what did he do? He didn't speak to me. So I get home, excited, I got the food, I got everything. As soon as I walk in, he said, what did you do? I said, Dad, I got everything. I said, no, you didn't speak to Ms. Warren. So I had to call Ms. Warrington up, and I had to apologize and say, you're right, Ms. Warren, there is something wrong with me. I am so sorry that I didn't speak to you. And I had to listen to her talk about Georgetown, Delaware, and Jesus for 20, 25 minutes. Those are the people we grew up in Southern Delaware. They don't understand all of this, but they helped to raise us. North Philly, very different. My mother did not believe in a spiritual retaliation. She was used to growing up in neighborhoods segregated neighborhoods, where she was chased out of those neighborhoods because of the color of her skin, her family, and her friends. And she equally chased people out of her neighborhood. It was equal opportunity running and chasing. regarding racial conflict where my mother grew up. When she came to Southern Delaware, she thought she had come to a foreign country. She did not understand the brown people, she didn't understand the white people, the migrants, the Native Americans. And mostly because she didn't understand them, because when they were in the presence of white people, they would physically give way and keep their head down. Not my mama. She wouldn't go somewhere, she walked. She didn't really care what you thought. Before we go into the supermarket, she gave us a talk. Don't ask for nothing. Don't touch nothing. Do you understand what I'm saying? I don't care how many kids are climbing walls. They're not my child. Do you understand what I'm saying? Anybody ever give that talk? Anybody ever give that talk? Anybody ever give that talk this morning, maybe on your way? Why does a parent give that talk? Just yell out. Why? Protection. Absolutely. Yes. Sometimes people say, it's because you'll make me look bad. She wasn't worried about that. Sometimes people say it's because we don't have enough money. You touch it, you break it, I got to pay for it. She wasn't worried about that. She wasn't worried because we never, ever acted out. You would never find my brother Brian or Christy or me ever acting out. Why? Because we were too scared. We were in church 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. She told us that story. This is a form of socialization. To not just talk to us, but to teach us about how they might look at us. Does that make sense? Now, when we look at research in health, one of the areas we're looking at is how well do young people not only know who you are, but you know how the world perceives you. That is, you have your own narrative, but you also have to know how other people might think of you very differently. And you've got to read, be literate around these moment-by-moment interactions. And we can't be perfect. The goal is how is our hit rate? How much do we walk into rooms and we can feel that something's about to blow up? Some of you may have friends, you love them to death, but they're a little clueless when it comes to social situations. They're not literate, they're not great. They want to go into the conflict instead of when it's time to run, we all need to run. And we think about that in a sort of racialized way. So there's this issue that we think of, how well do we notice what's going on with us in these sort of racial ways. So we'd be in the supermarket, and some days we get our food, go home, no problem. But other days there would be somebody who would be upset with my style, or my mother's style, or my brother's style. And they would get pissed, and you could see in their eyes that anger, that sucking of the teeth, and who did they think they are? And then somebody would step up, usually at the end with the conveyor belt. The worst thing you could do with my family was to throw our food into the bag. And once that happened, it was over. My mother began to tell them who they were, who the family was, where to go, how fast to get there. You know that whole process, right? And so when I look back at our family, and you think about the work that Brian's doing now, we were exposed to a kind of socialization where when it comes to racial conflict, sometimes you have to pray. That is, you have to think through, you have to process, you have to ponder before you make a decision. But other times you got to push, you got to speak up, you got to do something. And the combination of that is where we are trying to focus this notion of racial literacy, right? How well do I know when to speak up? And so telling my story, remembering my culture is a key part of that, is what we're finding. And that if you leave your culture behind, as you're getting this education, you're getting a sort of miseducation, as it were, because you're going to need that narrative, right? You're going to need your own story to navigate the craziness of this world. And so telling the story is important, remembering your story is important, but being your story is ultimately important. There's a quote I want to just get to that helped me when I first started at Penn by Malefe Asante. It's from the Afrocentric Idea, 1990, he wrote this quote. I encourage you to read it. But he talked about living in a westernized world. And he said the arrogance, peculiar arrogance, and I've used it it's been so helpful. It's called the arrogance of not knowing what it is that they do not know. If they speak as if they know what all of us need to know. Does that sound familiar to you? You're in a context with people, The arrogance of not knowing what it is that they do not know, and if they speak as if they know what all of us need to know. This is where you need your culture. This is where you need those stories. This is where you need your, if you are salt, you should be salty. You shouldn't put that on the side. If you're loud, you're supposed to use that for justice. You shouldn't put that on the side just because other people are uncomfortable. And then there's this other quote that I used for a long time to help me get to thinking about Frantz Fanon, who was a Caribbean psychiatrist, who talks about the difference between choice and freedom. He says, I find myself suddenly in the world and I recognize that I have one right alone, that of demanding human behavior from the other. So at Forward Promise, we think of health for boys and young men of color. It's not just reducing violence. It's not just bringing in cultural symbols and processes. Those are absolutely important. It's also about recognizing dehumanization, right? It's about treating each other as human. And do I know when somebody's treating me in a way that is human? And do I have the right to demand it? And I have to say it to myself first before I be able to say it to somebody else. Where do I get the voice to say you have no right to treat me that way? Right? Where I find and speak up for those moments. But then he says I have one duty alone, that of not renouncing my freedom through my choices. That we can make decisions, but we give up our freedom. And so being your story, in my view, is important, and why I feel very honored to get this award and to follow my brother in this process is because of this sort of notice, sort of process. So what we've looked at around why is it that racial socialization is important is because it's a preparation. Why? We don't know always when we look at the research why these outcomes are positive. But one reason is we think that socialization reduces that stress of being different. So if you are salty, or if you are loud, or if you are different, that you're not going to be defined by somebody else's narrative about that difference. Right? You fall in love with your own ideas, you fall in love with your own way of speaking those ideas, you fall in love with your own style. And it so happens that maybe the people that helped to raise you got you to that spot. But talking about these issues reduces the stress, and you feel more confident in your own skin, in your own style. The only problem is, when we think of racial literacy, it takes practice. And I know some of you are saying, practice, practice. We're talking about practice. Yes, we are talking about practice. And if we had time, I'd give my views on how Allen Iverson is very relevant to this discussion, but we don't have time for that. I'm just going to end with a poem by County Cullen that I think I have here. It's called From the Dark Tower. So we shall not always plant while others reap the golden increment of bursting fruit, not always countenance abject and mute that lesser men should hold their brothers cheap. Not everlastingly while others sleep shall we beguile their limbs with mellow flute, not always bend to some more subtle brute. We were not made eternally to weep. The night, whose sable breast relieves the stark white stars, is no less lovely being dark. And there are buds that do not bloom at all in light, but crumple, piteous, and fall. In the dark, we hide the heart that bleeds, and wait and tend our agonizing seeds. I love this poem, and we've used it in our work with young men and boys and girls in a both-and way. So when we think of our young people, we think of you, we think of how you are you're agonizing seed. You have all this potential, but you're in a crowd, you're surrounded by thorns that might choke the life out of your potential, and you still need support and protection, and that's what I see happening in this center. That's what I see happening in the visions of your leaders. And your leaders need support too. But part of the notion is, what I love about this poem is not always the struggle that you go through will last. Not always, not everlastingly. Not always will you be on the wrong side or the rejected side of a particular argument or position. And that there's something beautiful about your darkness. There's something beautiful about your saltiness. There's something beautiful about your culture that if you don't embrace, you will miss out on the essential aspects of resilience that allow us to get through these moments. The lion story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. tell your story, but you got to remember your story and then eventually be your story. Thank you very much.
At this time, we're going to entertain some questions, and a question ends with a question mark, not a comment with a period or ellipsis. Seriously, feel free to entertain any question that you may have, because this is the Q&A time. We don't want it to be just a monologue, we want it to be a dialogue. So feel free to entertain any question, because we have one of the nation's most eminent clinical psychologists before us. So, yes, sir.
Sir, thank you for coming and speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Just have a quick question. This is something I've been thinking about for a long time. That pertains to our community. It seems to me that in the 50s and 40s and 30s that our community was actually better off than we are now because of the fact of inclusion. And by that observation, in your opinion, from your studies, what is your opinion on segregation? Do you think it actually helped us more, or did it hinder us more?
Wow, you start out with a big one. All right. I want to show you one stat on some research we've been doing, and this is with young people in a program called Prep for Prep, where the practice is training around being academically prepared to go in some of the best schools in the country. So over 600 young people we looked at, and what we found is that the more they when we asked them, what are you stressed by being in these predominantly white contexts? Most people expected to be the academics, but it was not the academics. They were very talented, they managed the academics without the problem. It's the social issues that were most stressful. And those social issues were racial issues or difference issues, right? And so what we found when we asked them, if you look here, that the more you reported having these stressful racial interactions that were conflicts, whether they were subtle or blatant, you thought of the schooling experience as a threatening place, an unsafe place. And those are factors that lead to dropout, lead to health issues, lead to staying in longer, right? Not getting enough sleep, not eating well in a sort of camp. But if you said you got coping strategies through socialization, through leaders like Bell folks, you didn't see the places so threatening because it was a protective factor. So my analogy is, to answer your question, is that I think there's some big problems around segregation or integration, and here's why. Here's an example. If you could leave your house and go to the library, and go to the swimming pool, and go to the rec center, and go to the school, and see a police officer that carried the same message that your mother and father or your community or church had, that's a healthier environment. That's a community. But the problem is, with integration, is that we only have one narrow place where we got that message, and everywhere else we went, we got somebody else's narrative. So I see that as a big problem of integration. Not as just a legal reality, is that when my child, I have two boys, 27 and 13, and we're not going to talk about how that happened at all. But they are babies to me. So I worry whenever they walk into places now, right? And one thing I wouldn't say is segregation because it's a legal construct, right? That is, we didn't have a choice to be in a place. That's a very different reality. But the cultural support that you could get if you moved from home to the school to the library was health producing. And that's where I would say, rather than just compare integration and segregation, I mean, what did you get when you got integration? What were you open to, and then what were you locked down from that relates to your health is a better way to go about it. And so what we're saying here is that if you get the support, you can survive a threatening environment, right? It's like you see a lot of sand. Some people see a lot of sand. The question is, if they go with a bathing suit, they think it's a beach instead of a desert, they're in trouble. But you can survive a desert, but you can't bring a bucket and a bathing suit. You got to bring the right gear, you got to get the right preparation. And that's what we think racial socialization, that's what I would argue what you all are doing here. You're preparing them for the environment. So we can survive deserts, but not without the supports and not without an honest understanding that this is not a beach. This is a desert. So that's a kind of a both-and answer to you. So can we survive non-supportive but integrated environments? Yes, but we can't see them as beaches. We got to see them as deserts. Yes.
My name is Sean Boyd, and
How you doing?
a question is, what some of the reactions that you saw with the reality of the skill we had, the dream of the skill, and it didn't really work out?
Say that one more time, sorry.
So, like, we were talking about basketball earlier.
Yes.
Some of them, their dreams of the skill met the reality of the skill, there were some reactions.
Yes.
Some of the things that you saw.
So, a lot of things. So we actually did not care about the talent of young people. And over 3.5 years, in the first iteration, we went 400 boys. And so, and part of that research included, some kids who were very talented, literally could have gotten college scholarships, and some who could barely hold the ball. But we wanted them to be together because sometimes if you're the most talented, you still have weaknesses. And sometimes, if you're not talented at all, you still have strengths that can be used. So an example would be if I can get the ball at the right spot. And I videotaped most of what we did. So I can tell you what happened before the fight, during the fight, and after the fight. And we did a lot of things to intervene. But a big conflict, if you don't help me get my game on, there's going to be trouble. I'll start yelling, I'll quit, I'll leave. At the time, Allen Iverson was king, so the crossover dribble was key. Right? So there's some kids who don't want to even finish games. If I cross you over, break your ankles, you fall on the ground, I give up the ball, I don't have to score 1 point. Why? Because and we need them to engage in all of it, right? But that's a problem. But I can talk about you for at least a week, and everybody else will talk about you because they saw your ankles broke. So how do we keep kids in the game even when they blow up? And we also have to keep the security guards and the police in the schools from engaging the young people. And in 5 years, we never had an incident. We just said, if we need your help, we'll ask you for help. So the young people need the opportunity to blow up without it meaning something dangerous is going to happen. Because the same blow up that you see in the court, you'll find on the street corner. So if I learn how to get frustrated, so if I can talk about your mom and that really bothers you, but talk about your mom doesn't bother you at all, then I get a sense about how I can help you navigate. And I'll put you under pressure. I'll trash talk to see how much you can handle to build up your confidence over time. But I need to see you in your worst scenario, not kick you out when I see you in that worst scenario, and teach you some skills to keep you back in the game, whether you're good or bad, right? And we've seen kids low on the totem pole, not very talented, rise up on the totem pole because they don't give up. And we've seen some real talented dudes get frustrated and give up so easily. And some of you are coaches, you understand this reality. Our goal is to keep everybody in the game. Right? And suspension is not useful, expulsion is not useful. I don't know if that helps. Okay. You have another question? No. Yes.
I don't know if you're familiar with the health communication, the theory of ethnic identity.
Mm-hmm.
How is the recast theory that you come up with different than ethnic identity?
Sure, yes. So some of you may know of Robert Seller's work and Bill Cross's work where we look at identity around issues of how much do I believe in my sort of racial self. So one notion of ethnic identity is essential. So when I walk through the earth, do I see myself as a black man or as a Delawarean Southern black man? And I need that where I go. If I go to school, I want to see something like that. Like in Do the Right Thing, when someone says, how come there are no black people on the walls, right? He's thinking, I should be everywhere. There should be a part of me. I like that part of me. Why isn't it on the wall? That's a central kind of identity. There's also the issue is, do I know how much people look at my identity, which what Robert talks about as a public regard. Some of us say the public looks at blackness in a positive way. Some of us say, no, the public doesn't look at blackness in a positive way. That's another dimension. Literacy and socialization is different. Identity is more what I believe. Literacy is, I want to know what skills you have when somebody calls you an N-word, what you're going to do. So that's more emotional regulation, not just belief. It's like, you know, how am I going to react to this moment? Now, if I underreact, that is, I pretend it don't bother me, and I'm still thinking about it 2 weeks later, it's taking up energy from focusing on science, major, that's a health consequence. If it interferes with sleep, and I don't think racial identity helps us to navigate those kind of moments as much as what skills do I need to identify that what I really wanted to do is be more direct. Overreact is I cuss everybody out, even if none of y'all were involved in the incident, right? The real incident happened last week, and I can't find that so y'all gonna have to do. That's also a health risk, because it's not actively getting at what really bothers you, right? And so we're more interested around socialization, and they're connected. We just think socialization precedes identity. Identity doesn't help you around coping as much as literacy would, and for face-to-face encounters, and for in lesson minutes. That's where our target is. But identity is absolutely important. Most of that research, though, was done on college students. And we think you need to start, like if I ask you right now, what grade do you think young people are most likely to be expelled from school? How many of you would say elementary school? How many of you would say middle school? How many of you say high school? Right? Most people say middle school because they had a terrible experience in middle school. But the answer is preschool. Right? And if I may not find it, but children in preschool are three times more likely to be expelled from school than K through 12 students. Now that's not the kicker. The kicker is that there's a racial disproportionality. African American boys are the highest to be expelled from preschool. Now what you should know is that we've known this since 2005. Walter Gilliam, who's a colleague of mine, has been doing this at Yale. We now go around the country talking about it. We've known this since 2005. So what I'm saying is racial identity doesn't help us to understand why teachers would see a 3- and 4-year-old black boy as a threat to them. And so even though you're in college, you got to understand the narrative doesn't start here in college. And that identity research is important, but if it only starts in college, it's missing a whole issue, right? So whatever you all are doing to tell your narratives to young people is just as important as how you tell your narratives to each other. You've got to reach back because the insults and the struggle is early. It's not late. So that's another difference between identity work, racial identity, ethnic identity, and socialization. We go back to the beginning. So. Yes?
My name is Jason Burke, and earlier you talked about belonging, fitting in.
Yeah.
So my question would be about code switching. So
Yeah.
I think here also notice a lot of people, they may have a certain way that they talk to African Americans, whatever they talk to another African American, how they talk to them, and also their white colleague. So would
Yeah.
you say that code switching would be a way of that person fitting in? Would that be a way of that person like belonging?
It's an excellent question. And I think the response I would have is, do you notice what's going on with you when you code switch? So we work with young men who are only in predominantly black communities. We've actually had to teach, some of you may know, some would argue with us, there's no such thing as racism, right? So they're not in environments. They're still getting hit around colorism and sort of within group hostility around difference. But skin color, hair stuff. But the question is, when you code switch, does it bother you? That's a different level, right? So some people might be good at code switching, but you might feel like it steals something from you to do it. And then that's a health risk. And if it's interfering with your sleep or your focus, so the better question is not if you're a good code switcher or a bad code switcher, is do you count the cost of code switching? Now some people it doesn't bother them. I can do this and do that and I'm still me. But if you walk around feeling like you're not you when you do that, then I would argue that's not healthy. And the question would be, what would you want to do? Do you have a choice in wanting to do about that? The shape-shifting stuff we found, and this is related to some expulsion rates. We interviewed alumni in some of these schools, black male alumni, and they would say they really had survivor guilt for some of their best friends in middle school, and they envied them, even though they made it through high school. They envied the voices of the ones that got kicked out because they were loud. They didn't let anybody tell them anything to do. They stayed on message, right? And they wish they had a little bit of that. So I would say, how's code switching working for you? And do you notice, does it cost you anything, right? And so I think that's a better issue around health. If you can track the effects of shape-shifting on you, and you find it doesn't have a big detriment, then you're in the right space. But you got to take care of yourself even as you're moving up the ladder and succeeding. It's not enough to just succeed. Yes.
My name is Aaron McCall. Would you say that it's still just important to share those narratives of like the experiences that you face as a Black person in certain environments, even when you are on a campus like this one or the one that you are a professor at, where most of the campus is not interested in hearing it?
Yes. And I think journaling is another way to think about this. So when we're training doctoral students, right, or it doesn't matter. Children in 5th grade. I tell a story of a 5th grade in Chicago school that I went to, and we teach them the racial literacy skills, and part of the skills is how well do you calculate, locate, communicate, breathe, and exhale. So calculate would be, what feeling am I having when I code switch? It might be joy, it might be confusion. We have to calculate how intense is it on a scale of 1 to 10. 9. I'm confused every time I code switch because I'm not sure I'm being me. So that might be one thing. Locate is where in your body do you feel it? Well, some people say I feel it in my shoulders because I feel like I'm holding back. I was in the 5th grade in Chicago, 7:30 in the morning, and Native American girl, she used the same strategy. She said, I'm angry that I'm the only Native American girl in the school. And then she said, I can feel it in my body. It's like a bunch of butterflies fighting with each other so much that they fly up into my throat and choke me. She knows herself really well, right? Now, if you know yourself really well, you know your own narrative really well, nobody can take that from you, right? Somebody tries to put you in a particular box, it won't stay. She knows what's really bothering her when it bothers her, as opposed to you ever, spend a few weeks wondering what happened, what's going on, and then all of a sudden it comes to you. Health would be, can I get better at judging the health hits that come? So practicing telling your story is a way to take care of yourself. It gives you juice to navigate day to day. In the same way, if you're hiding your story because you know it's going to make other people uncomfortable, you're giving up your juice that you need to literally make it through this environment. And that's why doing it alone is not healthy. Being in a place like this is a way to actually do that. And I would argue, write it down. We say to our students, you need to fall in love with your own ideas, right? And nobody else can take that from you. And if you're in relationships where people don't appreciate you falling in love with your ideas, you might want to rethink those relationships. Because that's what you're here for. You're not here to swallow. You're also here to engage and push back. And if you don't have juice, how you gonna push back?
Can't take any more questions because we have a little reception, so there'll be a little time for that. Let's give him a round of applause. We're just so happy that Dr. Stevenson took time to give us share some of his work. As I said before, he is one of the nation's eminent psychologists. I would say arguably he's on the top of the food chain as it relates to working with urban youth around the country. I'm glad that he's in our presence because when I was coming up the faculty ranks, I used to read his work, and so I do bear witness. I understand a little bit about Delaware because I went to Delaware State University, and those guys in Southern Delaware, they thought they could play football, but they couldn't play football as well as they thought they could. But nevertheless, I can bear witness that the people there had a rich soul, rich spirit. We used to go to the fair in southern Delaware, and it certainly mimicked the fair in South Carolina. So I saw, you say Mississippi, I say South Carolina. So I saw a lot of similarities. As I said before, Dr. Stevens is the recipient of this year's Mac A. Stewart Award for service, and Dr. Stewart was one of the co-founders of the Todd Anthony Bell National Resource Center. I was the fortunate one that was the beneficiary to be able to have the opportunity to run the Bell Center. And I can tell you, it's probably been the best thing in my professional career. We give this honor to project him, and Dr. Stewart wasn't able to make it, believe it or not. He is a Morehouse man. He sent both his sons to Morehouse College, and so he does have a slight bias towards the Todd Anthony Bell National Resource Center on the African American male. And one of the things he believed at the time, he said, we can make a difference in the lives of African American males, not only on this campus, but across the nation. And so in a way to project Dr. Stewart and the work that he did and laying the foundation, we created this national award for an individual who is doing amazing things, whether it's in government, philanthropy, the private sector, or public, that are doing amazing things in the lives of African American males. This year, the committee had no hesitation. It was clear, it was unanimous that Dr. Stevenson was going to be, he should be the recipient. And the thing about this, this award, is similar to the MacArthur Award, the Genius Award. You can't nominate someone. We have a set of candidates that we review and we look at the work that they're doing unapologetic. I'm so happy that Dr. Stevens was awarded a Robert Woods Foundation grant for $12 million. Anybody who know anything about the Woods Foundation, they barely even give you $1 million or $500,000. But to get $12 million, it just says a lot about him and his work. And his colleague who he works closely with, she was a recipient of this award many years ago and was very affirming and when I told her that he was the recipient. So the Mac A. Stewart Award the Mac A. Stewart Distinguished Award for Service in honor to Dr. Howard Stevenson for placing himself in the service of great purposes and great causes on behalf of African American males. I asked him to come to receive this award, and if you don't mind, if you would give him a standing ovation, because
Thank you very much, and I'm deeply honored for this award. Thank you.
Good evening. How's everybody doing? All right, my name is Dan Thomas. I'm the program manager within the Bell National Resource Center. And again, we thank you for coming out and being with us today. Within the Bell Center, we really push 4 pillars on our students. Those 4 pillars include scholarship, brotherhood, leadership, and professional development. Tonight, we will recognize 2 students that have truly embodied scholarship at The Ohio State University. Each year, we throw out 2 challenges to our early arrival program participants. The first one is to see which cohort out of the 8 will average the highest cumulative GPA, and trust me, it's always very competitive. The second one is to see which individual out of the entire cohort will maintain the highest GPA out of their class and graduate with that. Starting this year, the person with the highest GPA will receive this beautiful award, that they could wear at graduation representing the center. At this time, I would like to call to the front of the room Mr. Tony White and Mr. Thomas Mangesha. These two gentlemen currently maintain the highest GPAs for their respective classes. Tony is in his third year studying both journalism and dance with a minor in theater. Tommy, who's to the far right, is in his fourth year studying neuroscience on a pre-med track. Gentlemen, for all of your hard work and accomplishments within the classroom thus far, we would like to present to you this commemorative BNRC coin, and I look forward to seeing which one of you will see if you're able to maintain your status and graduate and walk across the stage with this medal around your neck. Congratulations. Unfortunately, our second year representative, Joseph Stanton, was unable to attend. He had midterms going on right now, so imagine that he missed his for midterms, but definitely he's trying to maintain that GPA as well. Before we conclude, I would like to thank our co-sponsor, the Moritz College of Law Office of Diversity and Inclusion. They helped us secure this space and as well as market the program. Before we transition into our next portion of the program, which is hors d'oeuvres in the back, I would like to thank the faculty, staff, and community leaders that continue to support the Bell Center as well as our students. Your contributions are invaluable, and I look forward to seeing you at future programs. I would also like to thank Dr. Stevenson for taking time out of your busy schedule and visiting with us this evening. I know we were talking earlier, he has a big event tomorrow afternoon, so he's running back in the morning, but again, thank you and congratulations.